The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
It's not about not having to work hard, but it is about recognizing sometimes just pushing yourself harder isn't the right answer. We need to look for others with gifts and learn. And that's just an example of the benefit of recognizing limits and living within them so that we can find others who have what we're lacking.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Kelly Kapic is a professor of theology at Covenant College near Chattanooga. His most recent book is You're Only Human, How Your Limits Reflect God's Design and How This is Good News. In this episode, Dr. Kapic and I talk about productivity shame, gratitude, and the truth that finiteness is not a sin. Also, in a first for the Habit Podcast, we discuss magnanimity and pusillanimity. Kelly Kapic, I'm so glad you're on the Habit Podcast today.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is great.
So I really enjoyed your book.
Thanks.
The name of which is now escaped me. You're
Only Human.
Yeah, You're Only Human. Yeah, I knew it was some '80s song. I was
Yeah, a little Billy Joel in the background there.
Yeah. But you know, the sanity of this book, the idea that we put these unreasonable expectations on ourselves, both on what we can accomplish, what we can control, and then when we don't meet those unreasonable expectations, we somehow think it's a failing, or I think that's something that is worth wrestling around with. So thanks for writing this book.
Thanks.
You make the case. I mean, it's almost a case that doesn't have to be made. We feel a lot of shame around our finitude, right? The fact that we're finite beings.
Yeah.
We go from either bragging, I'm so busy, to feeling shame for not, accomplishing. It's always embarrassing to me to like. I never want to say I'm just so busy. For some reason that makes me feel embarrassed.
You're right.
Because as you say, you feel like you should be able to do all the stuff all these unreasonable amount of stuff. And as you say, to be finite, that's not. I mean, that's it's not. Finitude is not a sin.
Right. Yeah. One of the guiding principles of the book, and something I've been sitting with and wrestling with for 20 years or more, is that basic idea that drives the book of finitude is not sin. And I do think we confuse those all the time. And so we feel, finitude is not a word a lot of people use often. So they get, it's confusing. And just to help listeners, that doesn't necessarily mean death. Death can be part of finitude. But in this case, I'm actually concentrating on just the fact that to be finite means to not know have limited knowledge, have limited strength, you can't be more than one place at a time, all of those kind of things, even without even talking about death, without even making it a negative. It's just, that is what it means. It's a fancy way of saying creature. You're a creature. And part of being a creature is finite. And so I'm very interested in how we've confused the goodness of being a creature with sin. Now, even Christians don't always use that language, but we feel guilty all the time, and non-Christians too. And it often does betray certain theological assumptions. I'm very interested. I think it's fundamentally not a time management problem, but a theological one. And so we don't tend to think in that way, but I'm interested in exploring, like, what expectations do you think God has for you? And most people actually really, they'll say, no, nothing, but you really have to explore that. Pastorally, psychologically, a lot can come out. A lot of us do have pretty deep concerns about how God views us that show up in these ways.
You're saying a lot comes out of answering the question, what does God expect of us?
Yeah. What does God expect of us in a day? Yeah. And then if someone gives a good answer, well, he knows that you can only do so much in a day and you need to sleep, and sleep is a good thing. And well, then why do we have such lopsided expectations, right? Right. And there's other things going on there. But I think often lingering is some bad theology, that we really think God is a taskmaster. He's about to-do lists. Even the way people take verses like redeeming the time, we don't even know how culturally we've just assumed now that's about productivity rather than something else, right? That is a great simple example of just how profoundly we've been affected by these things.
How would you frame redeeming the time, not in terms of productivity?
Yeah, I think it is about growing in our awareness of the very presence and work of God in our lives and in the world. And being about kingdom work. And so it's trying to think, but it's not about using every waking hour to get things done, right? Yeah, right. And Christians have baptized that efficiency productivity model completely. Yeah. And so one of the tests is like, do you feel guilty if you're reading a novel? Because it's not work. It's not getting things done. And it's kind of, you have to go in a sideways thing with unexpected questions to help all of us understand how much we've been affected and how kind of disordered our assumptions have become. Yeah.
One of the clues to what's important is, if something's a means to an end, then the means can't be the most important thing. And so a clue to what's important are the things that aren't a means toward other ends, like reading a novel.
Right. Perhaps. Or going for a walk, right? Yeah. Or painting when you're like me and you have absolutely no talent at all, right? Or drawing, but you're not doing it because you're selling it, not doing it because it's even worth hanging in, even in my house, but because there's something good in that, right? Yeah. Or, whatever it is.
Do you actually paint and draw?
I draw, and I'm terrible.
And you're not good at it.
Yeah. So just so you know, I'm not joking. One of my best friends here is an artist, and we were in New York. He was teaching an art class, and I was visiting him there. And we're out on the lawn there in Central Park, and he was sleeping. And he woke up, and he knew I was sketching the whole time. And he got up and he looked at my art. It was one of the best, and we're very close. And he looked at me with a big smile, and he said, "Kelly, I really love your naive art." which was his way of saying, you draw like an 8-year-old, but I love you anyway. And he's absolutely right. But it's part of, and he's helped me and others, that's not the point. That's not why I'm doing it. It's not because I'm good at it. Right. There's other things going on there. So, yeah.
A really important idea in your book is you're not just talking about accepting our limitations, begrudgingly accepting. You're talking about rejoicing in them. See, our limitations don't threaten us, but they liberate us to worship God and cherish others.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about that? I mean, I understand accepting limitations. Why do we rejoice in them?
Yeah. I mean, one of the great signs is how we think of the word dependence. Dependence. When you say the word, certainly in the West and definitely in America, emotionally, even me, it hits is like, ew, that's not a good word, right? We think of codependence, and these are all negatives. But the reality is God created us to be interdependent with other humans. I mean, he made us to be dependent on him, dependent on the earth. And when we live without fully acknowledging that, it actually hurts us. It hurts our relationships. It hurts all these things. So starting to see these things as positives rather than negatives, I don't have to hold up the whole world. God is, right?
Yeah.
And it actually, I think people who are aware of their finitude tend to pray. People who are living in denial of their finitude, prayer is just an optional potential, something like that. Those are kind of interesting kind of things. But let me just give you an example, even in a non-Christian kind of world, or it's not necessarily within the church. So my wife and I just recently watched this fantastic documentary on the saving of those school children in Taiwan years ago who got stuck in that cave for months and months, and the water had risen.
Thailand, right? You said
Thailand. Thailand. And they were there months and months. And so this documentary kind of tells the story of how they finally got rescued. And part of what captured my interest is you had Navy SEALs from Thailand there who, I mean, these are the top.
Yeah.
And they went in to try and they couldn't do it. And in fact, eventually one of them died. The truth was they're top athletes. They knew how to scuba and all that, but they weren't trained for caving. It's a very particular kind of thing. And then you had these, as they would describe themselves, nerds from all over the world who, and it's fascinating to hear their stories. When they were little, almost all of them were picked on as kids.
Yeah.
They were not athletic. They were not good. And they, in their own way, discovered underwater cave diving. And where others panicked, for them, it was a peaceful place.
Wow.
And they're like experts. So they brought in these middle-aged, slightly overweight guys, and they're the ones who rescued these kids, who led the whole. It's an amazing thing.
Wow.
And it is an example, because at first it was like, no, we'll take over. We're the SEALs.
Yeah.
And part of finitude is going, I need to look, where are my limits, and where then has God provided others? It's not about never trying to, I mean, this was really hard work, and it was very risky, even for those who have the skills. It's not about not having to work hard and try, but it is about recognizing sometimes just pushing yourself harder isn't the right answer. We need to look for others with gifts and learn. And that's just an example of the benefit of recognizing limits and living within them, so that we can find others who have what we're lacking.
Yeah. And it makes it possible for us to think of other people as our allies and not our competitors.
Exactly. Exactly. We now train kids thinking we're doing good because of certain views of self-esteem. You're the best. You're the best. Well, there's only one the best. And as a college professor, one of the difficulties of our job these days is this is often the season of life when kids who've been told you're great at everything discover they're not. Yeah. And maybe they're not even in the top percentage, and they're not the best. They're not the brightest. They're not the most beautiful, and it doesn't make them bad, but their worlds start to crumble because they've been told that.
Yeah.
And they view everyone as a competitor rather than learning to celebrate and delight in one another.
Yeah. I mean, think about the guy who gets picked last in the NFL draft.
Right.
That's, you have feelings about that.
Right.
But I did the math once, and it's something like you were in the 0.004% best football players of the people who started in, high school or whatever.
Yeah, that's a great example. I love that. That's a fantastic example, because the way even they get talked about, they're an 8th round draft, like they're one of the best athletes you'll ever meet in your life, right?
Yeah.
And it just shows how skewed all of this is, and this kind of superhero model. And as you know, at one point in the book, one of the things I'm interested in exploring is that myth of the heroic individual, because even in thought, it's a myth. It's not really true. Whether you're talking about Elvis Presley and his dance moves, which he didn't originate, he drew from others and modified, or Martin Luther's insight on, salvation by grace alone and faith alone. The whole Wittenberg faculty had that. But the way the story gets passed, because it's easier, is we make individuals heroes rather than the complexity of networks and friendships and history and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a great reminder. It occurs to me that when we accept our limits, our creatureliness, that's what puts us in a position to accept everything else, right? And when I realized that I'm not, when I realized that I woke up this morning in a world I didn't make, then I am in a position now to receive, and not necessarily go out and conquer. I mean, we can talk. Yeah. And I think we do need to talk before this time is up. Is what is the relationship to work and receiving?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Joseph Pieper says something along the lines of, I don't. Shoot, I think. Oh, here it is. The truly great and uplifting things in life come perhaps not without our own efforts, but nevertheless not through those efforts. And so our effort, there's a role that our effort plays there. And yet the best things in our life aren't coming through our efforts. Exactly.
Yeah. Do you mind if I go back to the first part of what you asked? Because I want to explore that, and then we can jump to the second part, maybe even particular thinking about writing with that. But this first part, in terms of, you mentioned, waking up and receiving and that kind of thing. One of the spiritual practices that I mention in the book and encourage people is to cultivate the practice of both lament and gratitude. And I think lament and gratitude are two sides of the same coin here, because it is learning to be honest about the world and about God. And when you wake up and or when you're living and things are really hard and they seem bad and problematic and God seems distant, or sickness is striking people you love, whatever it is, the very practice of lament is an admission you can't control it. And it's turning to the only one who is sovereign and good, and who can absorb those laments and takes you to Christ. And that's a longer conversation to make sure it's not this abstract, this is not about God as an accountant, just kind of manipulate, or a puppet master. But anyways, lament is a helpful practice because it helps Christians stop being syrupy and fake about the world. No. Things are really bad. The flip side of that is gratitude. Gratitude is recognizing also we are receivers. These are gifts from God, right? All good gifts come from above. And gratitude is something to cultivate. It's not that there aren't things to be grateful for. They always are. It's just, are we aware of them? Are we attentive to them? And God actually made us that way. There's all kinds of psychological literature. I've worked with a guy named Robert Emmons at UC Davis, who's a psychologist and works in positive psychology. And I know there's some debates about positive psychology, but there's fascinating studies about gratitude studies. And you can actually have someone do a gratitude journal for a month, just anyone, make them write down 5-10 things they're grateful for every day. And by the end of the 30 days, blood pressure goes down, people sleep slightly better. It's just, actually measurables. Now, as a theologian, I get nervous about certain things like that, but there's also something that just resonates, right? God made us to be grateful because we're creatures who have always been dependent. And all that's doing is getting us a little bit more in touch with how he made us. So
it aligns us with reality.
Yeah, exactly. Just it's as Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about, it's just the real. That's what's real. And we're just finally starting to pay attention to it.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that is the undercurrent of your book, is we're coming to terms with reality. Yeah. And as it turns out, reality is a better place to live than all our imaginary worlds that we come up with.
Yeah.
To avoid reality.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because I do think the space, another way of saying it is the space of the real is the space of actual love. We all talk about love. We all think we love, but we love the idea of love. Real love is messy. Real love is hugging someone that's sweaty. Real love is listening to someone whose life is a wreck. Real love is not getting everything done on your to-do list because you had to slow down and help a kid, or you spent half an hour snuggling with the dog on the couch, whatever it is. Efficiency can become the enemy of love. And so I'm interested in some of this. It can sound very philosophical to talk about time and all that, but we're talking about love. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, efficiency is dangerous.
It is surprisingly so. Yes. I mean, I know, because it's often an idol I love to worship at, Yeah. And God can be incredibly efficient. He can turn water to wine in a second, but the normal pattern in Scripture from Genesis 1 on is God likes to take his time, and he likes process, and we're very uncomfortable with it. And I know it's been important for me, and I need to keep reminding myself how comfortable God is with process, and that I need to be comfortable with it too.
Yeah, that's so good. I want to sort of move the conversation a little bit in the direction of, since this is a podcast about writing.
Sure.
I want to maybe try to apply some of these ideas specifically to writing, and I don't know if we can. We'll try this. Okay. We'll see how well this works. But you make the connection between finitude and particularity.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if I'm part of the fact of being finite and not being the universe is that I'm particular, and I'm distinct from you and from even the people who are closest to me.
Right.
I'd like to continue down that path from finitude to particularity to the idea of the voice of the individual. I mean, a writer's distinct voice.
Yeah.
And I'm leaving it to you. I don't necessarily know how to make those steps.
No, I think, that's fantastic. There's kind of two thoughts, and let's see if I remember the second. But let me start with this. I do think particularity is crucial for writing, and it is theologically important. And one of the temptations in both theology and in writing is we think we can reach the universal by being universal. And that's actually not how it works. Normally, it is through the particular that the universal is reached, right? Talk about the one and the many. So this is still pretty abstract. Let's try with this. Scripture actually says that Jesus is tempted in all ways as we are, yet without sin. Well, here's the question. Is that true? Well, it's a trick question, because obviously I'm a theologian, I'm Orthodox. I think the answer is yes. But let's just ask it again. Honestly, has Jesus been tempted in every way as we have? No, he was never tempted as a single mom in New York with 6 kids and who wanted to throw one out the window, right?
Yeah.
That was never a particular temptation of his. He was and so it sounds very spiritual to say he's tempted in every way and not think through what it means. And what you end up doing is undermining the particular humanity of Jesus, which is very important to orthodoxy. It's also very important to pastoral care. So no. Jesus had particular temptations in all the very kind of categories of human experience, but they weren't universalized in that kind of way. So as writers, I think we rightly write out of our particularity and story without apologies, knowing that in the particularity, people will see genuine humanity and can relate to it. And then I think you can make connections and move from there. It's not that they say, oh, that's exactly what happened to me, or that's exactly how I think. But I do think particularity is a way. There's an irony. By becoming more particular, sometimes we can reach more people. I think particularly of a book I wrote on suffering, and that was the case. I really had to wrestle through. By being more particular about things, the book's primarily about physical suffering, but I've had a lot of people who dealt with sexual abuse and other forms of abuse write and say how helpful it was and other things. And it's the particularity, even though it's different, that I think resonates.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk through the you're not using finitude and particularity as synonyms for one another. They're related notions. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, finitude is just the overlap is tremendous. I'd have to really think through that, but because it can become quite a philosophical debate. But a particular creature is what is finite. I mean, finite is just a philosophical idea of the very limits of something, right? Mm-hmm. Or it requires a thing. It requires certain kind of limits or space or whatever. And the reality is everything is finite except God from a Christian perspective. The fancy definition of creation is everything that's not God. That's the definition of creation. Everything that's not God, which by definition means everything is finite except God. But then all that he makes, whether you're talking about an angel or a particle of dust or a human, there's particularity in that.
Okay. And then you, in that chapter, you sort of play that out in terms of we receive God's love, for instance, as a particular being. Like, it's not just that that God loved us in a general sense,
right?
Or loves us in a general sense, and therefore has no choice but to tolerate me, even though I can be kind of a jackass sometimes.
Right.
But rather, he loves jackasses, specific jackasses.
Yeah. No, and that's a great question. Thank you for even exploring that. So, as you know, like the second chapter is, does God love me? And we say God loves the world all the time, but I've found even very serious Christians who've been Christians for a long time, does God love me? They say, yeah. But when you scratch a little and get under that, we often really struggle with the idea that God might actually love me. And I've started to change the question and say, does God like you? Now, I'm a theologian. I know all the potential questions here, but it's still a good question. Does God like you? And that's about particularity. Like, does God just find your personality irritating? Is there just a general standard personality and everyone's got to be the same? No. He loves the bodies he made. He loves the personalities he's made. He doesn't love the sin that distorts us, right? And that hurts shalom. So it's very interesting. Augustine has this great line where he basically says, he's standing amazed about God. And he says, somehow God is able to love what he made. And here he's talking about each of us made in his image and our particularity, and hate what we made, which is our sin. So he actually, because people are like, well, Kelly, I think you're being too sentimental here. God hates us because he hates our sin. Or no. Augustine's got it right. He loves what he made. He hates the sin and he's going to have to deal with it. But don't think that means he doesn't like you, that you're an extrovert or that you are really into the, spaceships or I don't know, whatever your interest is. You love sci-fi and others don't. He loves how he made you, right? He doesn't love the sin. He loves what he made.
Yeah, I think sometimes we think in terms of almost a syllogism. God loves human beings. I'm a human being, therefore God loves me.
Right.
Therefore God doesn't have any choice because we just set up this big category of human beings. And
exactly.
And I slid in there by being a human being.
Yeah. And it's kind of like you often feel, if you ask someone, do your parents love you? They'll say yes. And then I ask, do they like you? You'll get a lot of hesitation sometimes. Yeah. And that's the beginning of a conversation, right? Because it's exactly what you said. They feel like, well, they're my parents. They have to love me. So the like question is actually often more interesting to explore. And it's along these lines in the 16th century, the Heidelberg Catechism, when it talks about the Lord's Supper and receiving the Lord's Supper, they're very intentional in the language that when you take the Lord's Supper, you confess that he gave his life, he gave himself for me. and it's very personal. And I found that's harder than most of us want to think, but it's so important because it's easy to believe God loves Mother Teresa and, if Billy Graham or, whoever it is, or your Christian football hero, whatever it is. But to actually go, no, or the poor person, God loves them. But what about me? That actually is an act of faith to believe he could love me. And I'm not impressive. I'm just this person. I got sin. I got a mess. I don't love God the way I should. No. He loves me. There's a particularity there that I think is very beautiful.
Yeah. You keep going off to theology. I'm trying to talk about writing.
Oh,
Kelly.
I'm sorry. Sorry.
No, one thing I was thinking about in that chapter about particularity is, this has come up on other episodes of this podcast, but okay, I can't write like Marilyn Robinson, but she can't write like me either.
Yeah.
There's a particularity in what we do, and that's it's hard to lean into that, right? It's hard to say, to acknowledge that my vision of the world, the way I can talk about that, really does bring something. I feel like I need to conform myself to my favorite writers or whatever. And
no, that's a great. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I want you to talk.
Yeah. So I love that, and I guess I would encourage, especially those who writing is a newer thing or it's a struggle, because this is like book 14 or whatever, 15. But I turned 50 this year. And one of the things I've been reflecting on is it feels like even just in more recent years, I'm getting more comfortable with my own voice.
Yeah.
Now, unlike many of your listeners, I write nonfiction. It is often of a theological pastoral bent. So I found, like, my PhD is on a 17th century figure. There's something very comfortable of hiding behind other people. Right.
Yeah.
But there is, just like someone who's writing fiction, to put yourself out there. And in fiction, it's an indirect way too. That's hard. And there is a growth process. I do think we all kind of imitate writers that we look up to. And it takes a lot of time and process to start to find our own voice. And I think that's all right. Or, but
I think imitating other writers is a decent way to start finding your own voice.
Yeah. I mean, here's the other thing I would just say. When I talk to writers, often the number one thing for me, when I'm honest with them, is I think of writing as psychological warfare.
Yeah.
I mean, it is just, and so in the same day, in the morning, I can look at something I've written, and with all honesty and integrity, I could read it and go, I think that's pretty good. I think that's really helpful. And then at 3 that same day, I can read it again, and with the same honesty and integrity, think, this is such crap. It is not worth the paper it's on.
Yeah.
And to not believe either, to just learn to distrust yourself and just in the sense of you're not the best, you're not the worst, and just keep going and let other voices in that process. And then you find some particularity in that.
Yeah, that's good. So I'm going to, just because I really want to talk about this, there is no transition here. This is just me changing the subject. All right.
Okay. It's great.
One of the most important ideas in this book is the idea that humility, that the basis of our humility is not we're all sinners.
Right.
Which we are, by the way. I mean, I'm
right.
Presbyterian. I don't mind talking about sin. Right. but the reason humility is essential to my humanity is because I'm finite.
Yep.
And so, of course, the fact that I am sinful is related to that, but it's not the central fact of it.
Right.
And so you make a point I'd never thought about before. If there had been no fall, humility would still be an essential part of what it means to be human, because we are finite.
Exactly. You got it. Great summary. I actually, if you say to people, we need to talk about humility, or let's talk about humility. It feels like, okay, let's go to the dentist and get a root canal. We know we should talk about it. We know it's good for us. We know we should have it, but it doesn't sound fun. But rightly understood, I think it's joyful. I think it's life-giving. And even how we think of the eternal Son of God becoming man and humbling himself, what does that look like? The incarnation, I mean, you and I are recording this during Advent. The incarnation, the idea of God taking on a human nature and becoming human, is God's great yes to his creation. It's somehow the creator taking on creatureliness, right? Well, that is his way of saying, what I made, I like, right? And that includes dependence. And so, yeah, humility, I really do think at its root is just the idea of recognizing what's real, like we've talked about. Yeah. The reality is I'm dependent on the earth. I mean, we had a pandemic to slightly remind us, oh yeah, we are dependent on these things that are beyond us. But dependent on the earth, I'm dependent on neighbors, and I'm dependent upon God. Simply recognizing that is the good of being a creature. And that's just humility. And that really is meant to unite us together. To unite us to God and to create a situation for joy. And dependence is not sin. What sin does is it perverts the dependence. Now I'm going to use you. Now I'm going to manipulate you or conquer you. And so it screws up the relationship.
Yeah. So maybe you can help me make the transition to the next topic.
Okay.
Which is related. So we are humble. We have a proper relationship to our finitude, and our finitude includes our gifts, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And so you talk about, you're using Aquinas here to talk about magnanimity and pusillanimity.
Yeah.
A couple of words. I guess we still use the word magnanimity. We don't use pusillanimity too much.
Yeah.
But can you? I'm now opening the floor for you to talk about magnanimity and pusillanimity.
Yeah, that's great.
Relevant to the ways we think about our gifts and our work and those kinds of things.
Yeah. I mean, magnanimity is this idea of kind of at its base, greatness of spirit, right? Or this really, and pusillanimity is this idea of smallness of spirit. And Aristotle was interesting. A great ethicist said, Aristotle would have hated Jesus and Paul because of their views of humility, because Aristotle had a problem with humility. Now, Aristotle's scholars would want to parse that out a little bit, but nevertheless. And so one of the things that Thomas Aquinas, a medieval leading Christian theologian who loved Aristotle, tried to work out is, how do you make sense of the fact that people do have different gifts, and that there are magnanimous people who have these tremendous gifts and can do great things? And G.K. Chesterton, who wrote a little book on Thomas Aquinas, at one point says, the difference between Aristotle and Thomas on this is, for Aristotle, the great man is great and knows that they're great. But for Thomas in the Christian tradition, the great man is great and knows that he is small. Right?
So good.
And that is the simplest way of explaining it is, yeah, you may be an utter genius who creates a vaccine to, help save humanity, whatever. And you are helping millions of people. You have these incredible gifts. You're still utterly dependent on the mother who breastfed you, upon the milkman, about, everyone else.
Try making a toaster.
Yeah. I mean, it's just everything. And then, but part of what's interesting is, and so there are temptations and sins that can be associated with having some of those quote unquote great gifts. But Thomas and the Christian tradition also understands pusillanimity, this idea of smallness of heart, can be sinful too. Yeah. Because the reality is God has given gifts. Yep. And to actually always shy away and go, I don't have anything, I don't bring anything, that can be just as problematic as thinking you're the answer to everything. Mm-hmm. It's a problem to say you're not an answer to anything, right? Yeah. And so, that's part of what's worth exploring is people, when they hear me talking about finitude, that sometimes they think that's Kelly, you're just saying people don't need to work hard. No, I'm not saying there's no time for working hard. I'm not saying there's no time for gifts. It's just whether, we're all in this together is a simple way of saying that. And that is both a gift and a responsibility. Everybody is needed. Everybody must participate. Everybody has dignity. It's not about your IQ level.
Yeah. We've got our own little patch of ground to tend, And so there's not much point in trying to ascertain who's the best, who's the second best, who's the third best. Why don't we all just tend to our business?
And part of even what we were talking about earlier with humility is the myth of personal identity and hero stuff is that even the person who comes up with the vaccine to save there's a whole network of people, right?
Yeah.
And their parents who help them get educated and their teacher. No one is solo. So it actually is a myth. And part of what we need to do is break that myth.
Yeah.
And see the genuine dignity of all of life and all of our labor and work and interdependence.
Yeah. And that magnanimity, in the Aquinas' sense, is a magnanimity that says, I've had these gifts. I rejoice in these gifts. Here, why don't you try some?
Yeah. And, to go back even to where we started with the Thailand example, you had these men who were interviewed that thought of themselves as very, very small. I mean, these were 40 and 50-year-olds who you could tell the weight of the mockery when they were kids and all of that. But they struggle with pusillanimity, smallness of spirit in one way, and yet they had this incredible gift. They rescued all these kids and did what no one else could do, and they also had the greatness of spirit in a way no one anticipated or expected. Yeah. And I think that's a fascinating thing because it's probably not these people are great and these people are small. No. It's all in us, all of us, depending on what area. I can't fix anything. I have smallness of spirit in these areas and I'm not helpful at all. So, it's just, these are fascinating things to think through. But
pusillanimity and the smallness of spirit is not, even that's not a question of the amount of talent or gift you have in an area. It's am I going to be generous with it or not?
Yeah.
Am I going to, if I have a gift, maybe I'm a genius, but if I'm not offering that genius for the benefit of others, then that's a smallness of spirit.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, it can also be a lack of faith to believe God and others. I mean, just like I think we need other people to help us see our blind spots and sins, and we need to be willing to have the courage to believe them when they point things out. It actually is a similar thing. We need to be willing to believe people when they point out gifts we have, because gifts are more often, not always, they need work and cultivation, but they're often more what you might call natural to us. And therefore, we don't see them as gifts.
Yep.
So we need to have the courage. Part of what Aquinas is saying is you have gifts. And when people are helping you see those, recognize that, believe that is from God, and now use it. You have a responsibility, not in a bad way, in a joyful way. Like, look what he's given you. Use it.
Yeah.
Right. You're good at the flute. Don't be shy about it.
Yeah.
Help us.
Yeah.
We're enriched when you play, and we're impoverished when you don't.
Yep. We think it's somehow... it's our responsibility to pay a lot of attention to our shortcomings so we can improve our shortcomings instead of leaning into what we're really good at.
Yeah, we need the courage to both admit and to hear people with our shortcomings, and also the courage to believe the positives.
Yeah.
And depending on your personality and background, either one of those can be super hard.
Yeah. In a great act of magnanimity, one of our friends came to the door once and said, I made this cake and it's delicious and I want you to have some.
Oh, that's great.
I'm like, right on. Yeah. Thank you for not hiding your light under a bushel, because
I love that. That's a great example, right? Yeah. And we get into this. It is true. We talk about you can make anything an idol. I worry that sometimes that talk gets overdone. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about writers. Writers often deal with, well, I don't want to brag about what I'm doing. I don't, and it becomes this very strange relationship with your craft because it's so public. Mm-hmm. So taking pride in it is often like, well, it's not that good, or I'm not very, that kind of demeaning thing. If you're a bricklayer and you lay good bricks, you should be able to look at it and go, that's really well done.
Yeah.
And those of us in the arts should be able to do that too without being called sinful for it, right? Mm-hmm. Sure, we can make it an idol, but the reality is you can also make an idol of beating yourself up constantly. So it's,
Yeah. Right. We're we actually have, in one sense, run out of time, but we can also keep, who's going to stop us, right? So I do at least briefly want to bring up something you quoted from Jocelyn, is it Glay?
Right.
Jocelyn Glay. And so since this is a podcast about, for and about writers, I just really wanted to bring this to the attention of our listeners. She says, creative labor has its own pace, and all you can do for the most part is show up and be present, ready to execute if and when the insights come. But how you feel about that work and how you feel about that pace is completely within your control. It's about mindset and expectation. And I think, we want to be, people who are doing creative work want to be productive. And I appreciate this reminder that, there are definitely things that are in our control. We can sit ourselves down at the desk and be ready. But this is also one of those limits that we need to come to terms with. This is mysterious. Creative labor has its own pace, and it is not, it doesn't match up very well with the pace of what we expect.
Western
productivity.
I kind of this, she talks about productivity shame, right?
Yeah, right.
And when that just really resonated with me because, and I think writing, it's easy when I'm teaching and I say, look, I taught my 2 classes for the day. I did my work. Writing is so difficult because it's like, did I do my 500 words or 1,000 words or whatever it is? Are they good words? Will they last? How does this work? And you have 2 things going on. On the one hand, I really have, both by talking to painters and novelists and others, I really do believe the myth of just kind of this creative genius who explodes and they stay up for 3 days in a row and paint or write a novel. And it's, I think most of us need to get past that because it actually hurts us to imagine that's what we're waiting for. Mm-hmm. And as you know, and your listeners know, most of the time it's just showing up on a regular basis and just plodding along. Right. Mm-hmm. And so I want to say that that's really important. But I've also, along those lines, I also have learned you just got to call it a day and go for a walk or a run or let but there's so much psychological literature to back this up now that the kind of intuition that we say, this came to me in the shower or this came when there's all kinds of reasons now we know in neuroscience that your brain is actually working, right? Yeah. And so when we say sleep on it, that's actually good biblical and psychological wisdom. So I think whether we're writing fiction or nonfiction, allowing yourself to not feel guilty, stopping, knowing your brain is still working. And you're often solving things you don't even know until later. Again, that takes courage because I'm tempted to just know I'm just going to keep sitting. I'm going to keep trying to do this. And that leads to productivity shame for me because I'm never done enough. Right. Sure. And that's a problem. Yeah.
And that act of going to sleep at night is the act of saying the world is going to keep on turning, even if I'm not there to turn the crank.
Yeah. And just to genuinely soak in the forgiveness of God and his presence and kindness, to actually believe he's kind to us, and that he, as it says in the Minor Prophets, he rejoices over us with singing. That takes courage to believe that, because most of the time, at least me, when I lay my head on the pillow at night, I don't feel like I crushed it. There's always so much I didn't do and, failures and all that. So both sin and just finitude. And so it really takes you back to the gospel. Either this is good news or it's not.
Yeah.
So
great. All right, let me ask you the obligatory last question, and that is, who are the writers who make you want to write?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, for me, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is someone, when I read him, just the sentences are rich and are constantly like, that is so good. J.I. Packer, in a different way, is the kind of certain model of the way he does things, in Eugene Peterson. Yeah. And in different ways, kind of in my genre, Michael Horton is an interesting person because he can write high for academics and also to the laity and the church. And that's interesting. In the same way, Jamie Smith and I probably have some overlap, and I like the way he does things. And I'm glad there's someone else who will try and address laity, who also will do philosophical and theological things and require quite a bit of his readers. Yeah. Great.
Well, Kelly Kapic, this has been so much fun. Thanks for
doing
this.
Here. Yeah. Thanks for reading the book. I appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, I assure you. All right. Bye then.
Bye.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. To check out more of our podcasts, visit rabbitroom.com/podcast. Our work at The Rabbit Room would be impossible without the generous support of our membership. If you'd like to learn more about membership at The Rabbit Room, visit rabbitroom.com/member. And thanks for listening.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.